name is Andrew Michael Trautmann. I was born in 1957 in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I've lived in Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Portland, and ended up here in Jacksonville. I was at Caldwell Banker in Atlanta and was a real estate broker. And we were working on some historic neighborhoods with the National Trust around the zoo in Grant Park, in the Virginia Highlands neighborhoods, and we have probably maybe 30 or 40 agents that were specializing in historic properties. And we started to have some interactions with the National Trust, and they started to tell us about this Jacksonville. The city of Jacksonville had a large urban historic resource that had been neglected, and that we might be interested in taking a look at it. So we came down here and took a look at it. So I sort of shuttled back and forth between Atlanta and Jacksonville from about 1988 till 1993. And what I did when I moved here originally is bought a house on the ocean at 14th Avenue South. So I lived in Jacks Beach. And our company, my partner Jerry Uselman and I moved down here, was called Recycled Properties, and we started buying properties at the beach first before we started buying anything in Springfield. Although I did buy one house in Springfield in 1988. So that was my first house that I actually bought in Springfield, was 1988. It was just something I'd never seen in my entire life in terms of the neglect that had taken place here. And I had experience in Florida. My parents lived in Clearwater. My brother lived in Carrollwood in Tampa. And I had spent a lot of time in Miami with an uncle, but never had been to Jacksonville or never explored Jacksonville. And so that curiosity sort of just piqued my interest. And when I got here, it reminded me of a city that somehow just was forgotten in Florida, that it didn't appear to be Miami, it didn't appear to be Fort Lauderdale, it didn't appear to be Orlando. It was sort of a outcast. And once I saw the architecture and some of the opportunity here, I thought this was something that maybe we could make a difference. So we started nibbling, and like I said, at the beach originally, and ultimately we focused on Springfield. Well, that's interesting. At the time we were making our decision to leave Atlanta, there were lots of social issues in Atlanta that were occurring in our community around HIV and AIDS at the time. And when we came here, we saw a lot of the same thing in this community, and it was even worse in a lot of ways, that people weren't having access to health care, they weren't being looked at by the community, and we thought we could make a bigger difference here than we could in Atlanta. Quite frankly, we were burned out in Atlanta with everything that was going on up there. So we made the decision that we wanted to come to a smaller city and maybe a little more manageable city. So we liked Jacksonville and decided on this one. 87, 88 was the first time that I really started to meet people over here. And there was just a handful of people that I really got to know, and they were committed to the community. They had decided they were staying and that they were going to make something out of the architecture and the history here and do preservation work, and we liked all of that. And the city of Jacksonville asked us to help set up property tax abatement. And that's something we had a lot of experience with in Atlanta. As a matter of fact, we brought that legislation here from Grant Park, and the city basically adopted it. They had to make some changes with the the tax statutes in the state, but whatnot, but they did implement it. There were also some conversations we had with the local government on zoning and density and lots of boarding houses, lots of halfway houses, lots of congregate living facilities were in this community. At the time, maybe 90% of all of those kinds of facilities for all of Duval County were literally located in the 1 square mile, which is historic Springfield. The zoning had been modified in Jacksonville over a period of about 20 years so that they could increase the density in these larger homes, and they used them for basically warehousing people. And if you took a large 4,000 or 5,000 square foot house in Springfield, you could put 30 or 35 unrelated people in there and then just charge for a bed and a bathroom that they shared at the end of the hall. And they received, those landlords received compensation from the state or the city, and there were several facilities that were for treating schizophrenia, several facilities for treating other issues that had where people had to be confined, and they had to stay inside those facilities, and they weren't allowed to leave those facilities unless they were unsupervised. That was sort of scary, all of that part. But after a while, you kind of got used to it. You met some of these people, and they really, as long as they had their medication, they weren't all that dangerous. They were just poor people that had an illness and they needed to be treated. So that's kind of how that happened. There were some issues with prostitution and drug use over here, which we were used to that in Atlanta too. So it's not like it was something that was just unique to Jacksonville. However, in Jacksonville, it was sort of concentrated in this community as well. And they had rooming houses or single family houses that the zoning was not being reinforced on. And the landlords that owned those properties would charge individuals $15 a night, and they would get their crack cocaine. They could have access to a prostitute and a place to stay. And it was quite profitable because they could have 15, 20 people in there. And if you do the math, you can see that the math adds up pretty quickly. And another aspect of that was that the police force in Jacksonville, the JSO, didn't seem real interested in fighting that or combating that or closing that down. It seemed to us they were more interested in keeping it confined in this one area of Springfield. And that sort of bugged me. And so I liked that fight too. So I wanted to take that fight on as well. Oh my God. It's changed in incremental amounts over a 25-year period to a completely different community now from where we were 25 years ago. And there's 4 or 5 major reasons for that. A lot of that I would attribute to a politician like John Delaney and his administration, Jake Godbold in that same slot. I think they were shamed into realizing that they had let this historical resource decline over the years. They had upzoned properties that should have been downzoned. They weren't enforcing their zoning rules. They weren't enforcing their property safety rules. And I think that just over time, the politicians in general, more specifically Delaney and his administration, did a lot to redress that. The designation by the federal government of Springfield as a contributing historic district in 1988 was major. That changed everything because the National Park Service got involved, the National Trust got involved at that time, the DuPont Foundation got involved at that time. That put a lot of pressure behind the politicians to make Springfield a viable historical resource that was put on the map to be brought back and restored to where it was. And a lot of the demolitions were stopped. A lot of the wholesale redevelopment plans where they were going to come over here and bulldoze large sections of the neighborhood was stopped. Everything changed once that designation originated. And once the property tax abatement went in, you could combine property tax abatement with federal tax credits, which essentially for every dollar you spent in Springfield, you got 20 cents back from the federal government as an incentive. And those tax credits could be sold, syndicated, you could keep them yourself, and then you would have either frozen or very low property taxes for 10 years, even though you had improved the property. So that was a pretty good incentive, and that helped a lot for Springfield to change it. And the other thing I would say is the auction that John Delaney did, where we had an auction over here of renovated houses where the city conveyed property to new owners of houses that had already been renovated. So literally you had one transaction between the city and a new homeowner where they picked up the keys to a house that had been totally renovated, moved right in with a new mortgage, and that was a real catalyst too that helped to set the stage for Springfield. Well, it was interesting. Harvard came down. They have a RUDAT study that they do. Well, the state of Florida, interestingly enough, the National Trust was already eyeing Springfield, and their conversations with us in Atlanta were that it was a very concentrated 1,400 structures and one of the most significant historic communities in Florida that needed the most work. So it had opportunities from their standpoint, and they saw its proximity to downtown is natural. I mean, they looked at the work that was done in Charleston. Of course, back then, Charleston wasn't as far along as it is now, but similar. Downtown proximity, Savannah, downtown proximity, Atlanta, downtown proximity, and this area in particular, because it had a good range of architectural styles. The streets were laid out in a grid. It sat in real close proximity to downtown. So it had it checked all the boxes from the National Trust standpoint. It was interesting because the DuPont Foundation, which is based here in Jacksonville, they climbed right on that along with the National Trust. And between those two organizations in the state of Florida, the city was the last one to be pulled into this idea of revitalizing this community. Well, I served on a number of boards and commissions. We had initially we had Springfield Preservation and Restoration. I served on that board. I served on the mayor's downtown development council. I served on the Main Street redevelopment initiative, which before I came here, the idea of restoring Main Street and bringing Main Street back was just a dream, and of course now it's a reality. That took a lot of time. I was appointed to the Zone 1 Urban Core Municipal Code Enforcement Board, which was made up primarily of Springfield residents, and that was a whole new thing for the city to do that, to take a community and then take residents of the community and put them in charge of municipal code enforcement. So that had a massive impact on Springfield because we were all neighbors, we all knew each other, we knew who the property owners were that took care of their properties, and we knew who the property owners were that were habitual neglect of their properties. And so we had a lot of influence by doing that. Also served on the board of the Neighborhood Housing Services, which was something that we had in Atlanta as well, which allowed us to underwrite our own financing for residential redevelopment, for 203K loans, and that worked for a while. That worked pretty well for a while, and then we brought in new leadership, and they had some issues with the way they were collateralizing their assets, and over time that kind of just disintegrated because it was really not well managed. Oh wow. Yeah, I can tell you we used to raise money any way we could because our nonprofit organizations were very thinly funded. And we actually met in people's houses in the back of the pawn shops. And there was various properties that were left to us in people's wills and stuff. They would leave us some really bad off pieces of real estate that were condemned or in very bad shape. And one of the ideas I came up with to raise money was to raffle off these houses because we didn't have the resources to restore them. We'd taken title to them, and that would be a good way to develop some interest in Springfield. And people came over and bought these tickets, and they did the raffles and whatnot. And as these houses were doled off after the drawings were done, we would tell the people where the house was, and they would go look at the house, and they'd call us back and say, I don't want that house. I really don't want that. Give it to the number 2 guy. And then you call the number 2 guy, and he'd go look. And some of these houses literally had trees growing up through the living room that went out through the roof. I mean, they were really, really in bad shape. So that didn't work. But it was sort of humorous that of all of those properties, I don't think we could ever find anybody to take them. And ultimately, we ended up having to demolish them. And there's lots of funny stories over here. We had issues with prostitution, and one of the things I learned about prostitution living in urban communities is that, for the most part, prostitutes are fairly they're not violent type people. It's a way to make a living for them. They have a clientele, and so you sort of get these relationships with them. You know their first name, they know your first name. And a lot of times, they would come over and knock on your door and try and solicit you for an exchange of services. And, you would have to kind of talk your way out of that and explain to them that you're really not over here for that. But it helps to keep a good relationship with everybody in the community as best you can. Oh, well, that's an interesting story. I was lost. I was shuttling back and forth between Atlanta and Jacksonville Beach, and for whatever reason, I got to Jacksonville about 3 in the morning. And I was always infatuated with driving around Springfield because I always found something else that was cool. And so I was on my own. I didn't have my partner with me, and he knew the neighborhood better than I did. And somehow or other, in the rainstorm, I pulled up on 5th Street, and this house was wide open in the rain, and there was a homeless man inside right on that staircase, and he had a little sterno lit where they could keep food warm or whatever, keep their hands warm, and it was glowing sort of like a heartbeat or whatever. The door was open, banging in the wind. All these houses over here were wide open. There was nothing boarded up, nothing sealed up. I mean, it really had a neglected feel, Springfield did. And I saw that glow inside, so I got my umbrella and I got my flashlight out and came inside at 3 o'clock in the morning, not realizing this guy could have killed me or anything else. I had no protection. And I started walking around the house. He left, and I went upstairs and I discovered the attic, and it had this circular staircase and this full basement and all this mahogany and all this quarter sawn oak, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing, and it's just wide open sitting here. So I got it inside in my mind that I wanted to buy it, and I kind of went through the procedures, found out what the loans were on it, and we had a strategy that we used back then that we developed along with the city, where if we found a piece of property that we wanted, we got the city to agree to condemn it, and then once they condemn it, they would issue a demolition permit, and we could use that permit to negotiate with the banks. So we would go into the bank, and the bank that had the lien on the property, for example, this house that was owed like $170,000. Of course, I couldn't buy it for $170 and make the numbers work on renovating it. So we would contact the lender, somebody senior, and tell them that we have a demolition permit and that your collateral is going to be demolished and you're going to have no collateral and a demolition lien, or you can sell it to me for $50,000. And they always said, yes, we'll sell it. We will call you in a couple of days. And we bought a number of properties over here. And actually, to tell you the truth, the banks that had property in Springfield as collateral just wanted out. They, the idea that somebody would come and pay them anything made them happy. And so we just sort of used that model over and over. But it basically took 2 years before I could move into it. So from 91 to 93, somewhere around there, end of the year. Springfield people, absolutely. George Baxley is somebody that nobody knows about that was a real pioneer over here. George owned a forklift company in Jacksonville, and he was a real salesman for Springfield. He was over here long before I was, and he restored a number of houses. He did the large house on the boulevard. He did this one across the street. His brother moved over here. Just a remarkable individual. He really was. We sort of clustered together as investors and developers over here. Harry and Rita Reagan. Harry was president of the city council, and he moved over here, decided to live in Springfield, and his wife Rita was president of SPAR, and Rita and I worked together for 13, 14 years on all kinds of different projects. So they certainly would go to the top of that list. More recently, people that have come and gone, like Louise Disdain, that was president of SPAR. She was, really just a tireless worker, and because a lot of this stuff is volunteer type stuff. It's not. It really is just something that you do willingly to help a community. You're not really, there's no financial gain in it, but there's a real satisfaction that comes from moving a community along, making progress. In Main Street, the work that we did on the Main Street, I was fortunate to be involved with Main Street from a concept to reality. And that's a long period of time that goes on there. There's lots of meetings, lots of changes, of course now it's all done, but there were a lot of people that came before that. I would throw Phil Neary and Lisa Neary into that with the Women's Club. Lisa and Phil kept that going, and Lisa's did an amazing amount of work for the park. Michael Bryant was selfless resident of Springfield for years, and Michael, I don't know how many meetings he sat in. He could sit in more meetings. I had a low tolerance for political meetings. It was hard for me to sit there for 5 hours, but he would do it. He would stay in those meetings and make sure the community got represented, so I give him a lot of credit too. So those people, come to the top of them. And Jerry Usman, my partner, who passed away about 10 years ago, he was more sold on Springfield than I was, and he's the one that really got me down here from Atlanta. Oh, wow. I guess a lot of the home tour stuff that happens every year sort of is a crescendo of we get to showcase all the little incremental improvements that we make, and we all get to share different parts of putting that together, and new people come in and maybe some old people come out. I know those home tours, either whether it's a spring tour or the winter tour, the Christmas tour, that's where we shine the best. People get to meet the people that live here. People get to see the houses that are here. Everything looks great and has a nice feel to it, and it's always another step forward. Every year we go through this. Now I guess you could throw Porch Fest in there as another step that goes, and they all seem to build on each other. So, I would say that time of year is pretty special. It's a very livable community. This is something I may not have shared earlier. In a lot of ways, when you can make a difference in a community and you can wake up every morning and feel really fortunate and also feel like you're making a difference, it's really nice. It makes for a complete life. You get to see all of Springfield has a lot of diverse people. You're not limited. You're pretty exposed to all kinds of political ideas, all kinds of ethnics, all kinds of food, all kinds of. So I like all that, and so I sort of attracted to that. And I think that it's only gotten better. I mean, over time here, it seems to have gotten better. And I enjoy walking in Springfield. I like the parks. I think the parks are something that's not quite up to snuff. So I want to upgrade the parks. I think I got the buy-in from the politicians, and that makes me feel really positive, and I think I can get that done. So I would like to, keep moving in that direction. And, sky's the limit now. So it's come a long way in 25 years, a long, long way. Oh, the future's going to be great. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I'm not sure how the commercial development on Main Street's going to come out, but I think it will come out good. I'm hoping it'll be a lot better than Riverside or San Marco. I'm hoping they'll pay more attention to the historical guidelines and keep our buildings, our newer buildings, more compatible. You were talking earlier about Taliesin or Scottsdale. If you notice, Scottsdale, Arizona keeps everything looking pretty historically, the continuity, and I think that's going to happen over here. And quite frankly, I think that's going to make us more desirable than Riverside, more desirable than Avondale in a lot of ways for a lot of people. And I'm already seeing that with tenants. Like I was talking earlier, I see tenants now that 10 years ago would never have lived in Springfield that now prefer to live in Springfield. And that's like seismic shift right here. So that's just right there alone tells you a lot what you already need to know. And then what happens downtown, one of the things we talked a lot about with the city over the last 20 years was that downtown and Springfield were kind of the urban, imagine the city being a bicycle wheel, and the core of that bicycle wheel is downtown in Springfield. And that's something I think is very true. So as downtown develops, I think Springfield will also develop. And I think that we'll see a lot more happening in our urban core. As far as the residential stuff, it's off to the races. They're putting new houses wherever they can now, and I think the redevelopment and restorations are just going to get better and better.